Hello, I am Emily Snow here with TheCollector, and today I have the absolute pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Roberta Bondar. Dr. Bondar was Canada's first female astronaut, as well as the first neurologist to visit space. And among a whole litany of other distinctions that I know we'll get into, Dr. Bondar has a new book of photography coming out soon. It is titled Space for Birds, Patterns and Parallels of Beauty and Flight, and it will be published next month on the 17th of September. So welcome, Dr. Bondar, and thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for asking me to do this. It sounds great.
Of course. And so to begin, you are globally recognized for many, many things, including space medicine research, fine art, nature and landscape photography, and environmental advocacy and education. So can you tell me a little bit more about your academic and professional background and what things led you to the work that you're doing now?
Certainly, like every enthusiastic 10-year-old with a boundless energy and curiosity, I was interested in science. I was interested in photography. I was interested in birds because they could fly. I mean, I couldn't. I was interested in all kinds of things in the natural world and interested in helping other people. So all of it took its time. I had 18 years of university to try to put it all together. Didn't repeat 1 year, but at the end of it, I ended up having a couple of research degrees, master's, PhD, and then I went on into medicine, and then I specialized in neurology, and then I subspecialized in neuro-ophthalmology, how we see and view the world around us. And at that time, NASA was actually really getting into the space program with diversity, and that having the space shuttle program allowed women to have an entry, because before they were demanding, it's very demanding to have test pilots that had many, many hours in command of jet fighters and things that women really didn't have easy access to. So the space shuttle program really provided that. So I had my hats off to the original women that were in the program and the women who followed. Because of that, I remember being in Boston doing my training in neuro-ophthalmology, and it was April in 1981. And the first space shuttle landed with Bob Crippen and John Young. And I remember thinking at that time, yes, I am going to now go down the path that I'd wanted to go down. And as a Canadian, of course, we didn't have a launch facility. But at that time, my aunt worked down in Florida, and she'd send me posters and things about the space program. So I decided I would at least start doing aviation medicine. And that's how I kind of got around trying to getting close to the space program. But I never really gave up on the idea of being a spaceman, which is the word that I had when I was growing up, because nothing had left the planet. So I followed the path. And when Canada came out and saying, hey, we've got this opportunity to work with NASA, I thought, hey, fantastic.
That is incredible. And what an exciting and multifaceted background you bring to the table. And it seems to me that your new book is this beautiful amalgamation of what sounds like some of your childhood dreams and your entire career and many areas of interest coming together. So as I've mentioned, your upcoming book is called Space for Birds, Patterns and Parallels of Beauty and Flight. And I have personally had the pleasure of previewing the book, and it's full of photography and insights that are as formative as they are beautiful. And I'd love to know what inspired you to create this particular book.
The foundation that bears my main name has a great interest in biodiversity and extinction. So I've been using and donating actually works of my photographic endeavors to the foundation for exhibitions throughout the years. I trained in professional nature and landscape photography at Brooks Institute in Santa Barbara, California, right after my space flight on the recommendation of the IMAX crew, because we had IMAX on our flight to take clips for Destiny in Space. As a result of that, I thought, after my space flight, I really wanted to do something more major because it was an international flight. My view of the planet, did change in flight when you actually see it as a planet. And then after doing a lot of landscape work, I realized that I wanted something living in that landscape besides trees, etc., and things we couldn't really detect without a microscope. Birds were my first love when I was growing up, and I thought, I'm just going to now look at migratory birds because they cross boundaries the way we do as astronauts without passports. We float over boundaries. We see the world, not all of it, but we see a big chunk of it. And birds have their migratory corridors. I thought it would be great if I could put something together to show people that life on this planet is indeed very precious. And birds teach us so much. They have so much to give. And we're at our peril. We are destroying habitat that they need. And I thought, well, if I could do something that combines the perspectives of space from the air and on the surface, maybe I can engage people better into being more sensitive about the surroundings that the birds need in order to survive. And it's actually what we need as well.
That's beautiful. And it definitely makes even more clear why the word parallels shows up in the title of your book, because you see these parallels between humans and birds. And Space for Birds, you specifically chose to focus on two migratory bird species whose populations are currently threatened or endangered. And those birds are the lesser flamingo and the whooping crane. And so, why did you choose to focus on these particular species?
These species are indeed in trouble because of habitat change. The first one, the whooping crane, is in the Western Hemisphere, and I wanted a corresponding bird in the Eastern Hemisphere, but one that had different characteristics of behaviors. And they are really not just across the world from each other, but across the world in terms of what they eat, what they feed, the habitats they need. But they're similar in the sense that they have to have these habitats in order to survive. The whooping crane, and it's no secret how old I am. So I was born in the mid 1940s. And at the time I was born, I think there were 14 adults and two young. They were the only ones that were known to live in North America, which is the only place they do live. And they migrate such huge distances, 4,200 kilometers, as we know now, from the Northwest Territories in Canada, where they breed, down to the Gulf of Mexico on the Texas coast in Aransas National Wildlife Reserve. So it was an idea that that bird was a great one to try to photograph. Difficult. They're very solitary for the most part in their behaviors, but they're big enough to see from a helicopter and photograph in their habitat, which was one of my criteria. The second bird, the lesser flamingo in Africa, has not been known to be called a true migrant, but now we're finding out more and more about these very exquisite birds, and they're amazing because they live on bacteria, well, algae and bacteria have to be eaten all day long, not to be confused with other types of flamingos in the world. And again, a big enough bird that I could see from helicopters, so I could look at relationships amongst the habitats that they use. And the United Nations Environment Program were key to help me identify that species. And in North America, certainly the Canadian Wildlife and the U.S. Wildlife Services people were very, very good at helping me look at the kinds of patterns that these birds were, the habitats that they were using. So that's how I picked those two. And it took over 12 years to do this project because, they are hard to find.
Right. There's just not only do you have a lot of considerations to even zero in on the species you want to, then to go from there and actually find and photograph them is quite an incredible challenge. And so between traveling across hemispheres and flying over habitats, and you even coordinated with the International Space Station for this book. So can you talk a little bit more specifically about some of the unique challenges that you faced and overcame during the process of creating this book?
Well, certainly, if I look at each of the three levels and each of the two birds, we could go on for a long time, so I'll try to be succinct. The first, in terms of NASA, the first hurdle, of course, because they knew me and they knew this project and I made a good case for it, I became a principal investigator with NASA and in Migratory Birds. So they helped me with coordinates getting to the space station. But the space station has to be in a certain configuration and it has to be able to fly over the habitats of not just these two birds, but 5 others that we're following as well. And these specifically, I wanted images with the edge of the Earth. So I didn't want to have just straight down shots. I wanted to remind people that we're on a planet and look at the long migratory corridors. You can't get an all-in-one glimpse out of the space station cupola, for example. So it took a long time, took years to get the right images with the right amount of light, with not enough cloud to obscure things. So that was one big hurdle. Aerially, we were in situations sometimes where the birds had left the building, right? They were there, and then a nice, we're getting on an airplane, a commercial airplane, to get down to a place to photograph the whooping crane, for example. But the winds were favorable for the cranes to leave, and they did. So it was trying to So we basically were photographing other birds that were in company with the whooping cranes as well. So that's a challenge, is trying to get someplace where the weather is appropriate for both the birds and the pilot here. I'm not the
Right.
pilot of it, but for the pilot for our helicopter where I was doing the aerial photography on the surface is the same kind of thing. Weather, opportunity. I mean, it's far easier for birds to get from one place to another and faster than human beings on commercial flights anywhere, for
Right.
sure.
That's amazing that you created what you did. That's a lot of indeed very unique challenges, both just logistically and also creatively and artistically. And something that struck me about Space for Birds is just the vast range of photographic perspectives that you were able to include. So you've created these highly detailed, personality filled close up portraits of individual birds that are beautiful. You have these sweeping panoramas of large flocks of birds, and then these aerial images that encompass entire habitats and migratory corridors. So, what do you think can be learned when you compare these images and also collectively consider so many different visual perspectives on a specific topic?
Well, my training in neuro-ophthalmology, how we see and view the world around us, really is key as a physician neurologist to understand how visual processing works. And the idea that art is the mechanism through which most often we have an emotional connection with something. We get excited in science, of course, when we make discoveries. People like to apply those to their lives, and that's wonderful. In art, we also want the creativity that we need in science to develop these experiments. It's a way of promoting interest and a person's own experience. So what I wanted to do with this book was have these artistic pieces, and that goes back to my professional training in photographic art, to bring out depth of the habitat, depth of the climate, seeing these lovely creatures interacting with that environment in a different way than people would normally see them. Normally, people see a picture of a flamingo up close, or they see it feeding or whatever, but they don't see the context in the habitat. And that's what we wanted to create. I wanted to show how not lonely the whooping crane was, but what they require in order for them as individuals to survive. And the same with the lesser flamingo. So it was understanding these behaviors, understanding the play of light, textures, the relationship between water and land, all of that to bring it together in some way that a human being can look at it, and the visual system will say, hey, pay attention to this, because this is something you haven't seen at this angle before, especially the space imagery.
Yeah, absolutely. And because this is, of course, a book about birds, I want to talk more specifically about bird's eye view photography. So I think the scientific value of a bird's eye photograph is very clear, especially when we're talking about birds, and it teaches us something about a particular bird and its habitats. And in your book, you also specifically assert the aesthetic and even the emotional value of bird's eye view photographs. So can you talk more about how and why you think a bird's eye view photograph can resonate on so many levels?
People fly in airplanes a lot, and if you have a window seat, which I really always would like, one can see the planet in a different perspective. Obviously, you get a little bit higher, and spaceflight is not just getting a little higher, it's getting a lot higher and seeing a different perspective. So the aerial view that we have as human beings, we can get with drones, and that's good. And we can get photographed in drones. Drones, we can't fly over the areas that I photograph because, first of all, we can't. We don't want to be scaring any kind of a bird or any other creature. It's not. It's not something you can do easily in national wildlife refuges anyway. And we're going to get to a certain altitude that if the birds see a shadow coming over, they could be jarred away from a nest, which is what we're finding with some of the photographs that people take over beaches where a creature like the piping plover would nest. So there are things that we are expecting from aerial images now technologically to give us a sense of a thrill to fly over things because they're video. But this book is about aerial imagery to help us do what we do sometimes out the window, contemplate life, contemplate relationships. And gosh, that wasn't that far away. Look, it's down the road. It's only 10 miles, but it's been like forever to get down those 10 miles. And now from an airplane, we see it's just like right next door. So the idea of looking at migratory corridors in an artistic way and saying, here are the relationships that we can see because we are up higher and see a different perspective. From space, it's the same kind of thing, different patterns that we didn't know existed before. It's very important to us as scientists too to understand that maybe there is something to be learned from stepping back and knowing more about things that we thought we knew about, to be able to see them in a different plane. Certainly on the surface of the planet, we see things straight out. We don't get a three-dimensional view from the top. And that's what these aerial images provide us, a different way of looking at relationships and habitats.
I think that's such an important and really impactful perspective that we often forget when we're just so accustomed to imagery that you said is intended to be more thrilling and entertaining, and to consider these perspectives on an emotional level and on just a creature to creature level is important and beautiful. And I think your book absolutely accomplishes that. And just one more question about aerial imagery. And specifically, you've mentioned the challenge and difficulty of coordinating with the International Space Station to get very specific aerial photographs of the planet's surface. And I found that the resulting images, they appear so vast and distant that they almost appear like abstract artworks. And in the introduction of your book, you wrote that seeing photographs of Earth from space, in your view, changed how we view ourselves, and it can change how we view non-human natural life. And so what is it that you think makes these particular space photographs so uniquely powerful in that way that photographs taken from Earth maybe can't contribute by themselves?
It's a good question. I hate to say sometimes you have to be there to figure it out, but what I'm trying to do with both the air and the space images is to bring to people the idea that just because you see a bird from the ground, you see it in the tree, doesn't mean you really know anything about that bird. And seeing something, a different perspective, seeing what they have to deal with, what the choices that they have to make, and what will impact them with climate change, for example. For the aerial shots, I think it's very important when we try to coordinate it out with the space imagery. The space imagery is about the depth and variety of the planet that a creature, the bird, has to fly over and decide where it is going to land. And it lands in a place where there is food. I mean, they follow the food. If the food's not there, they're not going to live. The food has to be in some kind of a habitat in the right kind of climate. And on the way there, they may get disruptions in climate. So from space, we're able to see this. We see up in the space station maybe 1,200 kilometers out the window at one stretch. But when it comes down to it, we're really only grasping at straws, trying to figure out what they are experiencing on the ground. And the impetus for this, for me in space flight, was that I did not hear bird sounds. I didn't take any tape stuff with me, but it was an eerie possible view into a future where there wasn't going to be bird life. And that was sobering. Not to see life on the planet, not to hear anything from the planet, makes the space images all more imperative that we get on the surface of the planet and try to protect, because there is nothing else except the odd bit of space stuff coming in terms of meteors, etc., coming into our planet. We're not going to get the whale from Star Trek movies into the planet or anything else like that in science fiction. This is real life and reality. And I didn't want to make it overpoweringly negative. I wanted to make it overpowering in the sense of what the reality is and the beauty of it, because I firmly believe if you love something, you'll want to protect it.
Right. And I think that very unique perspective that you gained from being in space, and like you said, kind of witnessing what that silence and what that absence of life would be like. I think that sense of a detachment inspires action and inspires empathy. And I think for me, a big takeaway from reading your book is that Space for Birds fundamentally challenges these preconceived boundaries that we tend to place between the disciplines of art and the disciplines of science. And in fact, in the book, you specifically write that art and science are intertwined and that together they can strengthen each other to portray information or a message or a feeling. And so, in your work, how have you seen that relationship and that interplay between art and science come to life?
I'm a very studious person in some ways, but I also like to have the real life adventure outside. And art is all around us. It's what we make of it, right? When we're in space, you just have to point the camera out the window and you're taking something that someone's going to say that's art because it's abstract.
Right.
It's a form that's making us think differently. My feeling as a scientist and as an artist is that I like going back in time to think about Leonardo da Vinci, for example, where at that time science was not separated as a distinct discipline in how it must work, but rather the curiosity of science that allows a person to try to look at the depth of the science that's in the view and then be not only stimulated by that, but be challenged by the artistic way in which it is presented in the environment. And then to try to couple that and make it into a simpler view for people. The problem that we have a lot about looking in the natural environment is that it looks too complicated and people take a snapshot and then they move on. Whereas what I wanted to do was to simplify these elements by positioning my camera in the helicopter or selecting the correct image from the millions that NASA had was able to find for me, to be able to actually find that one image that speaks to what it is that I felt. So in actual fact, I'm constraining people's creativity because I'm giving them my view, but it's a view that is bred through the discipline of science, but through the creativity of art and the experience of space flight and being a pilot. So I think all those things I'm trying to bring together to pull these various perspectives in of not just Earth aerially and space, but also about scientific and artistic. You can't do science without art because you have to be creative and learn that. And you can't do art without science because otherwise, how would you be able to use a camera or even use paints to paint with if you didn't understand a color wheel?
Absolutely. I think that multidisciplinary curiosity clearly empowers you in your work to create something unique and resonant. And of course, at the same time, empowers your audience to take away something informative and evocative from your work. And I think, speaking of art and science being intertwined, these days, there's obviously no doubt that your work in environmental advocacy and education just keeps growing more important and more urgent as we face various ecological issues. And so, on that note, what do you think is the role of fine art photography or just art in general in addressing these issues, such as species and habitat endangerment or global warming or anything else facing us?
One of the things that we try to do in the foundation that has my name on it is to try to engage young people as well as older people, because older people learn from younger people and vice versa. But the idea to get out in the natural environment in some way and look at things differently. So we run programs where photography is one means to the end. And that is because not everybody writes and draws necessarily as well as someone else. But through the technology of photography, we can actually get people to look at things like how many colors of green do you see in the environment, or what are the edges of the leaf like, or what kinds of things can you find if you're on the ground and taking a close-up shot. And so we run various types of exercises to enable people to see. And I think art and science, the combination of it, and through my bias of the technology of photography, because it's more universally available, to be able to engage people in the natural world to be able to think about habitats, to be able to think about, well, what does that snail really need, and what is that snail's role that we give it in the general ecosystem, and how is climate changing affecting this, and then going on and saying, what is my action? What can I do with this view? What should I be able to do? And so that leads into an early thoughts about ethics. And environmental ethics are the things that we need in order to make things better for the world, for all kinds of organisms. So that's kind of one way that I like to do as a neuro-ophthalmologist, is to have people see and train their eyes. Because when we look at things, we just use about 1 to 2 degrees of vision. The only reason why we see things is we sweep our eyes, even consciously, all over the place to try to get a whole view of something. When I'm giving people aerial shots, surface shots, or space shots to look at, again, they have to move their eyes around to see things. But they won't recognize stuff unless they specifically are trained to look. And so it's that look and see, and even if you see something differently, maybe it would stimulate someone to think differently, to say, oh, the next time they go out, to either look at the moon, knowing that we're trying to get back to the moon, or to look at a tree, knowing that climate change is challenging this tree to even be there, or to look at a bird and try to hear a bird and try to understand what the relationships are. So I think that's sort of a long roundabout answer, but it's one that I'll stick to.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic and multifaceted, and I think at the end of the day, kind of an actionably optimistic view of the world and what people can do and what art can do to address ecological and environmental issues.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that this book is about hope. Yeah. As I said before, I mean, if you love something, you want to protect it. One needs to be inspired, but then you have to have aspiration. You have to be able to figure out what you want to do once you're inspired. I do believe that the natural world is something that gives us so many ideas about so many new and creative things and ways of thinking. It's an extraordinary opportunity to make one's life much more fulfilled.
That is absolutely true. And to conclude our conversation here, I want to first, of course, thank you for sharing your unique experiences and insights, and especially for taking us behind the scenes of Space for Birds, Patterns and Parallels of Beauty and Flight, which comes out on September 17th, and I highly recommend. And so my last question for you is, in addition to the new book, do you have any exciting other projects on the horizon that you can talk about?
Well, it's this book too, I guess. The 3 species of the 7 that we've been trying to follow, are basically in the Western Hemisphere, North America. The one bird, the Arctic tern, does drift over to the Eastern Hemisphere a little bit. But it's a very interesting bird. And the other 2 include the piping plover, which is endangered. There are only about 200 birds left in the Great Lakes population, and there are 3 populations in North America. And then the third one is the red knot, and there are 3 populations of it, also in North America. And we're following it. It's their population declined over 40% recently, and we're trying to understand why. So the first thing, of course, is to introduce people to these species, introduce them to the habitats, before people will then start thinking, oh, gee, what can I do in my life so that I don't have a negative impact, so that my impact is a positive one.
That sounds just equally exciting and important. It sounds like you have some good challenges and adventures and things to learn ahead of you. And so thank you again for sitting down with me today, and congratulations on the upcoming book publication.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak about it. It's always a wonderful thing to be able to do. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.